that is, they take place in the head rather than in the gut. They are also transient, they can be changed by good evidence to the contrary. Thus, if I'm presented with an excellent review of the research showing me that multivitamin supplements are useless at best and harmful at worst, I'm likely to change my opinion on that issue. Opinion. That which a person believes to be factually true. But suppose a person believes that a vegetarian diet is unhealthy and unnatural, or that a requirement to wear seatbelts is an illegitimate intrusion on a driver's freedom, or that vitamins saved a friend's life. These opinions are no longer purely cognitive. It is almost certain that there are strong feelings embedded in them, along with an evaluation as to whether the subject is good or bad. An opinion that includes an emotional and an evaluative component is called an attitude. Compared with opinions, attitudes are extremely difficult to change, as we will see when we discuss the complex attitudes. Called prejudices. As you read the discussion of influence tactics in this chapter, you might want to keep this difference between opinions and attitudes in mind. What is an easily changeable opinion to one person might be a deeply entrenched attitude to another. Attitude. A special type of belief that includes emotional and evaluative components, in a sense, a stored good or bad evaluation of an object. We have already seen how susceptible people are to social influence, but here I will explore how this susceptibility depends on the particular kinds of tactics aimed at us, identifying the social psychological triggers that make us more likely to say yes. Sometimes, however, we can also be maddeningly resistant to persuasion, as when we try to use facts to change a child's mind about bedtime or change a friend's mind about politics. How are we persuaded? Why do we sometimes yield to persuasion and sometimes not? Effects of the modern media landscape. It is mind-boggling to ponder the changes that technology brings to nearly everything we do, even the way we walk. Just 10 years ago, we moved through the world as humans have for millennia, upright, eyes surveying the environment for potential danger or opportunities, or just to enjoy the view. Then, in 2007, the iPhone appeared and people everywhere suddenly began walking while staring down at their smartphone screens, doing anything from watching cartoons to conducting business meetings. I marvel at the inconceivability of it, the fact that these computers fit inside our pockets but have more computing power and functionality than the room-sized behemoths that NASA utilized to send astronauts to the moon. We use our phones for everything, getting updates on news, writing, consulting our calendars, getting directions, doing research, making reservations for restaurants, air travel, and hotel rooms, shopping, or selecting from an infinite number of entertainment options on Spotify, Netflix, or YouTube, immediately. This versatility only partly explains why most people who own a smartphone spend more than 25% of their waking hours with their eyes glued to its screen. Much of that time they are interacting with others, evaluating hundreds of potential romantic partners a day, or reading the latest thoughts from virtually anyone, our friends, professors, favorite musicians, even the President of the United States, and replying to them. We can comment upon and share any video, photo, or piece of music throughout our social network. On websites that allow comments, we can entertain ourselves by conversing with, arguing with, consoling, and celebrating our friends. We can harass, troll, or pass judgment on complete strangers 24 hours a day. Because these advances have fundamentally reshaped how we transact the business of our lives, many people are concerned about how our immersion in media affects our social interactions and well-being. Technology has improved social relations in some cases and worsened them in others. For example, until recently, if you were an African American man, hailing a taxi was often a demoralizing experience. Fearing trouble, taxi drivers would often not stop for men with dark skin. Then Uber arrived, an app that allows anyone with a credit card and smartphone to have a driver pick them up anywhere, anytime. For every benefit an app might provide, however, cell phone technology has enabled some unfortunate human tendencies, such as cyberbullying, sexting, and stalking. Distraction. Millions of people are literally addicted to their smartphones, which, like any drug, create an unending hunger for stimulation. Smartphones behave much like slot machines, doling out intermittent rewards in the form of alerts, news, tweets, and texts, all of which keep people continually checking for the next hit of social connection. Steve Jobs, who gave us the iPhone and iPad, refused to give these devices to his own children because he understood their addictive nature. One observer pointed out, it seemed as if the people producing tech products were following the cardinal rule of drug dealing: never get high on your own supply. As a result of the constant, sometimes obsessive focus on our phones, we are distracted from our surroundings, the people around us, and the tasks we are trying to accomplish. Cell phone addiction is highest in adolescence and associated with both depression and lower performance in school. If that weren't bad enough, smartphone addiction hurts innocent bystanders too. More than 30% of adults and 40% of adolescents admit to texting while driving, which demonstrably impairs driving and increases the risk of deadly crashes. Even when we're not actively using our phones, our reliance on them means that their mere presence frequently takes a toll on our attention. In one experiment led by Bill Thornton, college students took a test composed of a series of difficult or easy cognitive tasks. Half of these test takers were asked to put their phones away during the test. The others were asked to keep their phones close by on the table in order to answer an upcoming survey about its features. Although no one had trouble with the easy problems, the students who took the test with a phone in view performed about 20% worse on the difficult problems than students who stowed their phones out of sight. A similar experiment showed how this distractedness can also spoil our face-to-face interactions. Pairs of strangers were introduced to one another and got acquainted by taking turns talking about interesting and meaningful recent events in their lives. In one condition, the experimenter left his cell phone on the table near them. In the other condition, the experimenter left his notebook in the same spot. After the conversation, the participants rated their interaction and their partner. As in the earlier study, the cell phone was disruptive. When it was present in the room, people saw their partners as being less understanding and trustworthy and thought it less likely that spending more time together could lead to a friendship. Other similar studies find that the presence of a cell phone during social interactions reduces eye contact, engagement, empathic concern for the partner, and enjoyment of the conversation. Point 10. Social skills deficits. The average American spends about 10 hours a day staring at a screen, 5 hours watching television, and about 5 on their smartphone. Point 11. This means that the average American child spends more time immersed in electronic media than with parents or in school. You've probably heard your parents and professors say something like, "In my day, we talked to each other, told stories, made up games, and ran around outside." Today, a birthday party is just a bunch of kids in the same room, sitting around eating cake and looking at their phones. I worry about what this does to their social skills. Are their worries justified? Apparently so. Yalda Yules and her colleagues 12 measured the social abilities of school children, examining similar students from the same school, who on average spent about 4.5 hours a day consuming media on their phones. First, all of the students were tested on their social skills. Specifically, they were shown pictures of faces expressing different emotions and were asked to identify the emotion the person was feeling in each picture. Then, half of the students were sent to a 5-day summer camp that allowed no cell phones or other devices. The rest stayed home with their electronics. After the 5 days, all of the children were tested again, revealing a significant improvement in social intelligence among the children who were phoneless for 5 days. Although electronics, including video games, can be powerful tools for learning. 13. It seems that nothing beats good old face-to-face interactions for learning to read and how to interact with others. In addition to robbing us of opportunities to develop social skills, heavy immersion in social networking sites can encourage people to become more self-centered and narcissistic, and to believe that fame, wealth, and popularity matter more than friendship, generosity, and community. Point 14. That's not the whole story, of course. Clearly, there are pros and cons to our immersion in the digital world. It's instructive to remember that just about every new form of media was greeted with apprehension about its effects on the hearts and minds of the young. Socrates lamented the invention of books, which he said would promote forgetfulness. When comic books were introduced in the 1930s, parents were warned that comics would turn their children into juvenile delinquents. Radio, television, computers, texting, Google, and PowerPoint, all have been accused of making us lazy, less intelligent, shortening our attention spans, and ruining our social lives. 15 Yet our cognitive abilities actually grew over the decades that television, comic books, and other technologies flourished, and the crime rate among teenagers declined. 16 Technologies will continue to proliferate and change the way we live, and the best response is not to bemoan this fact, but to learn to use our devices intelligently and in moderation. Studies have identified the psychological and emotional benefits of turning off email and Twitter when people study or work, of having face-to-face conversations without a phone on the table, and taking walks in nature, looking up at the sky and trees. 17. In addition to how much we use media, how we use it makes a difference, too. A key determinant of whether immersing ourselves in social media elevates us or depresses us is how actively we participate. Do you passively look at other people's profiles, scrolling through without communicating? Or do you comment, like, and post your own news and pictures? It's the more passive use, lurking, that is most likely leave us feeling down, left out, and unhappy that our lives seem much less exciting than the lives of our friends. To enjoy social media optimally, we need to respond to others, just as in real life, we need to participate. By actively participating when we are online, and by being mindful and proactive about the addictive potential of our gadgets, we can reap considerable benefits and joys without crowding out or distracting us away from valuable offline experiences. 18. Persuasion. We live not only in an age of mass communication, but also in an age characterized by attempts at mass persuasion. Everywhere we look, someone is trying to educate us, convince us to buy a product or donate to a cause, or persuade us to vote for a candidate or subscribe to some version of what is right, true, or beautiful. This aim is most obvious in advertising. Manufacturers of nearly identical products spend vast amounts of money to persuade us to buy the product in their package. But influence through the mass media needn't be as blatant as an ad. Let's look at something that claims to be objective: the network news. Are the newscasters trying to sell us anything? With a few exceptions, no, but those who produce television news exert a powerful influence on our opinions simply by determining which events are given exposure and how much exposure they are given. What factors determine their selection? The primary one is the need to attract viewers. News is a form of entertainment. When those in charge of news programming decide which news events to cover, from the thousands of stories that occur every day at a local, national, and international level, and then which to present to the public, they make their decisions, in large part, on the entertainment value of the material. It's much more compelling to watch images of a flooded city than of people building a levee to prevent flooding. It is not nearly as exciting to watch a construction project. And yet a city's decision to build a levee may be more important news. Just as action events such as football games are more entertaining on television than quiet events such as chess matches, it is more likely that riots, bombings, earthquakes, massacres, and other violent acts will get more airtime than stories about people working to prevent violence. Thus, newscasts tend to focus on the violent or destructive behavior of terrorists, murderers, protesters, strikers, police, or out-of-control celebrities because action makes for more exciting viewing than does a portrayal of people behaving in a peaceful, orderly manner. 19. Moreover, the most violent stories are usually reported earliest in the broadcast, especially on local news programs, creating the message that the violent stories were the essential news of the day. As reporters put it, if it bleeds, it leads. Such coverage obviously presents a distorted picture of the world. In trying to entertain us, the news media unwittingly lead us to believe that people behave far more violently now than ever before. As we saw in discussing the availability heuristic in Chapter 2, people estimate the frequency of events by how easily they come to mind. When the media bombard viewers with bad news about crime and terrorism, people will overestimate the prevalence of violence and disaster. This bias both reflects and reinforces our evolved tendency to attend to what is threatening, that bad is stronger than good phenomenon. Little wonder that 60% of people surveyed in a Gallup poll said they believe that crime and murder are on the rise in America, when in fact, crimes of all kind have been steadily declining for 25 years. 20 This false perception may cause people to be unhappy, fearful, and depressed about the state of society and may ultimately affect how they vote. Their attitudes about other groups and other nations, and their desire to visit major urban centers. Of course, some violent events do warrant extensive coverage. Following the terrorist attack of September 11, 2001, most Americans sat glued to their TV sets because they wanted to know what was happening, and they needed reassurance that the situation was under control. They watched the collapse of the Twin Towers hundreds of times as the news channels gave that event round-the-clock coverage. How can we be sure that is what citizens wanted to see? In the 2 weeks following the attack, the number of people who tuned into CNN jumped 667%. The New York Times sold 250,000 more newspapers on September 12 than it did on September 10.21. It is good to be informed, and the media play a crucial role in keeping us informed. However, there can be a downside to this kind of exposure, as well. Whether it is intentional or not, repeated vivid imagery of this sort shapes attitudes and opinions. The constant images of the collapsing Twin Towers, as well as the repetition of bellicose slogans on news channels, contributed to the arousal of intense emotions in viewers and thus reduced the likelihood of any real debate about how America should respond. Instead, the proposal to declare war on Iraq sailed through Congress with hardly a murmur of opposition, a war that most Americans later came to see as a terrible blunder. 22. This is a social psychology book, not a political treatise. What I am suggesting is that, in a democracy, major decisions, like whether to go to war, benefit from rational public debate. Strong emotions, such as those stirred up by the news media, often get in the way of rational decision-making. As Hermann Goering, one of Adolf Hitler's top aides, said before being sentenced to death at Nuremberg, the people can always be brought to do the bidding of the leaders. All you have to do is tell them they are being attacked and denounce the peacemakers for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. It works the same in any country. 23. Media contagion. The media also exerts its power through a phenomenon known as emotional contagion, which occurs when one person's emotional behavior triggers similar emotions and behaviors in observers. When you go into a drugstore to buy pills of any kind, there will be a safety cap on the bottle. Want to know why? In the fall of 1982, 7 people in the Chicago area died after taking extra-strength Tylenol capsules laced with cyanide. This event, both tragic and bizarre, was widely publicized. Even in those pre-internet days, the story was ubiquitous. You couldn't turn on the TV or radio or pick up a newspaper without learning about the Tylenol poisonings. The effects of this prominent coverage were immediate. Similar poisonings were reported in cities across the country involving the contamination of mouthwash, eye drops, nasal spray, soda pop, and even hot dogs. Dramatically billed as copycat poisonings, these stories, in turn, received widespread media attention, creating a spiral of even more stories. Many people panicked, seeking medical aid for burns and poisonings when they suffered from no more than common rashes, sore throats, and stomach aches. False alarms outnumbered verified cases of product tampering by 7 to 1.24 because these events occurred just prior to Halloween. Worried officials in scores of communities banned trick-or-treating, fearing that many individuals might mimic the murders by contaminating children's candy. Emotional contagion. The rapid transmission of emotions or behaviors through a crowd. The initial Chicago poisonings were almost certainly the work of one person, who has never been identified or caught. But the belief caught hold that the wave of poisoning constituted an epidemic without a cure, in the words of one news service 25, and was itself the symptom of a sick society, a country going crazy. Many newspapers found themselves in the ironic position of first sensationalizing the poisoning incidents and then sensationalizing the subsequent critical comments of media experts discussing the disastrous consequences of such publicity. A few years later, 4 teenagers in New Jersey made a suicide pact and then carried out their plan. Within a week of this multiple suicide, 2 teenagers in the Midwest were found dead under similar circumstances. Media reports spotlighted the confusion and grief surrounding teenage suicide, with many feature stories about it, and that very coverage triggered some vulnerable, depressed teens to consider suicide a solution for their own unhappiness. Sociologist David Phillips and his colleagues 26 tracked fluctuations in teenage suicides by comparing suicide rates before the stories with rates after the stories. The more coverage devoted by major television networks to suicide, the greater the subsequent increase in suicides among teenagers. Suicides are particularly likely to spike when a celebrity commits suicide, both because their example generates more publicity and because they are more potent agents of influence. When depressed individuals learn that someone famous has taken their life, beloved figures like Marilyn Monroe, Kurt Cobain, or Robin Williams, they begin to think seriously of doing the same thing, especially if they feel an emotional link or psychological connection to the celebrity. 27 That's why suicide prevention researchers have found that when media stories avoid emphasizing or glamorizing suicide, and don't make it seem like a simple or inevitable solution for people who are at risk, the contagion effect is reduced. 28. I am not suggesting that the media should not report sensational events like the Tylenol poisoning or celebrity suicides. And I'm not suggesting that the news media are trying to foster violence or suicide. Rather, I am underlining the obvious fact that their selective emphasis puts the media in the position not only of reporting events but of determining subsequent ones. The more media attention an event gets, the more contagious it becomes, and the higher the likelihood that others will be inspired to follow suit. In today's 24/7 news cycles, sometimes the role of the media in reporting an event becomes more newsworthy than the event itself. Today, when a significant event happens, newscasters not only report on it, but they report on all the people analyzing it and commenting on it, and then their comments often become newsworthy. In its circularity, this phenomenon reminds me of a brand of table salt that was popular when I was a kid. On the box of table salt was a picture of a little girl holding up a box of the table salt, on which there was a picture of a little girl holding a box of salt, on which there was a picture of a little girl holding a box of salt, and so on. On 24-hour cable news channels like CNN, MSNBC, and Fox, the need to fill the hours of airtime with news and analysis has made this sort of redundant exercise commonplace. Effectiveness of media appeals. What about intentional persuasion? How credible and effective are obvious attempts to package and sell products through the mass media? They must work. Why else would corporations and political parties spend hundreds of millions of dollars a year trumpeting their products? Most of us have seen children being seduced by toy commercials that artfully depict the drabbest toys in an irresistible way. A child watching the Disney Channel, Nickelodeon, or the Cartoon Network is also inundated with fast-paced ads for cereal, junk food, and candy, which use familiar characters, promotional offers, and the promise of fun to persuade kids to get their parents to buy them the products presented in commercials. It works. 29 More than 90% of preschool children asked for toys or food they saw advertised on television, according to a survey of their mothers. 32% of mothers in another study reported hearing their very young children sing advertising jingles they learned from television. 31 And experiments show that when young children are given a choice of candy bars, they are significantly more likely to choose one that they saw during an advertisement or during the show itself. 32 Most children catch on after a time. My own children eventually developed a healthy skepticism about the truthfulness of these commercials. Indeed, one survey 33 found that by the 6th grade, only 12% of children believed that television commercials told the truth all or most of the time. By the 10th grade, only 4% felt the ads were truthful most of the time. And by the time they are adults, the overwhelming majority of viewers believe that advertisements contain untruthful arguments. The more educated that viewers are, the more skeptical they are, and that skepticism leads them to believe that they are immune to persuasion. If only the mere fact of knowing that a communicator is biased protected us from being influenced by the message. Unfortunately, just because we think we are immune to persuasion does not necessarily mean we are immune. Indeed, our sense of immunity can make us more susceptible to persuasion of all kinds. 34 In the case of many consumer products, the public tends to buy a specific brand for no reason other than that it is heavily advertised. The headache remedy business is an excellent example of our susceptibility to TV ads even when we know they are biased. A well-known brand of aspirin advertises itself as 100% pure aspirin, the commercial goes on to say that government tests have shown that no other pain remedy is stronger or more effective than brand A. What the maker doesn't bother to mention is that the government test showed that no brand was any weaker or less effective than any of the others, because all of them were straight aspirin. In other words, all tested brands were equal, except, that is, in price. For the privilege of popping brand A, consumers pay approximately 3 times the price of an equally effective but unadvertised version. Another product proclaims it uses the special ingredient that doctors recommend. By reading the label, we discover the mystery ingredient to be good old inexpensive aspirin. Such blatant attempts at mass persuasion seem pitifully obvious. Yet tremendous numbers of consumers set aside their skepticism even though they know the message is an obvious attempt to sell a product. Why? When we are dealing with identical or very similar products, mere familiarity with the brand name can make a huge difference. Robert Zajonc 35 showed that, all other things being equal, the more familiar an item is, the more attractive it is, even if the item is just a silly nonsense word. We prefer faces we've seen 10 times to equally attractive faces we've seen only 5 times. 36 We prefer words that contain the same letters as those in our names. 37 And we prefer pictures of ourselves that are backward. Whereas our friends prefer the non-mirror image of our faces. 38 Unless there is something inherently noxious about a stimulus, the more we are exposed to it, the more we will tend to like it. Suppose I walk into a supermarket looking for laundry detergent. I go to the detergent section, and I am staggered by the wide array of brand names. Because it doesn't matter too much to me which one I buy, I reach for the most familiar one, and, chances are, it is familiar because I've heard and seen the name advertised over and over again. If this is the case, then sudden increases in television exposure should produce big changes in familiarity and, perhaps, in sales. And they do. Several years ago, the Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company conducted a nationwide poll to find out how well the public recognized its name. It came out 34th among insurance companies. 2 weeks later the company repeated the poll. This time it came out 3rd in name familiarity. What caused this amazing leap from obscurity to fame? 2 weeks and $1 million worth of advertising. Familiarity does not necessarily mean sales, but the two are frequently linked. As evidenced by the fact that NW Root Beer boosted its share of the market from 15% to 50% after 6 months of television advertising. The primary function of many commercials is to get the name of the product firmly planted in our heads, which is why the product's name is repeated often while the competitor's product is rarely named. This availability of the advertised brand can suggest to us its superiority to the brand that comes to mind less easily. Then, once we buy the product and find that we like it, we develop brand loyalty. So although we rarely feel consciously influenced by advertising, we don't leap out of our chairs and rush to the supermarket to get that root beer. It can initiate a longer-term process that indirectly gets us to buy heavily advertised products later, when we have a choice. Point 39. Is voting for a presidential candidate the same kind of decision as choosing an insurance company, root beer, or brand of aspirin? The answer is sometimes. Sometimes candidates who spend the most on advertising receive the most votes, 40, but this happens primarily when they spend early in the campaign to define themselves against their opponents, and therefore establish the narrative of the campaign. 41 Commercials on TV are especially effective when the campaign centers on a highly charged issue that arouses strong emotions in voters. For a compelling illustration, let's travel back to the 1988 presidential campaign between George H. W. Bush and Michael Dukakis, former governor of Massachusetts, which featured what is now one of the most iconic political attack ads in history. In the summer of 1988, Bush trailed far behind Dukakis in the race for the presidency. Many observers were convinced that Dukakis's lead was insurmountable. Within a few short months, however, the lead had all but evaporated, and on Election Day, Bush won handily. A number of political analysts credit Willie Horton with playing a major role in this turnaround. Indeed, Time magazine referred to Willie Horton as George Bush's most valuable player, 42. Who was Willie Horton? He was not one of Bush's advisors, nor was he a major financial contributor to the Bush campaign. Indeed, the two men had never met. Willie Horton was a convicted felon who had been released from a Massachusetts prison before the end of his term as part of a furlough program. While on furlough, Horton escaped to Maryland. There, he raped a woman in front of her male companion, whom he had wounded and tied to a chair, a disgusting story, to be sure. Michael Dukakis was governor of Massachusetts when Horton's furlough was granted. Claiming that Dukakis was soft on crime, Bush ran a series of television ads showing the mug shot of a scowling Willie Horton and depicting criminals going in and out of prison through a revolving door. These ads struck a chord with many Americans, who were frightened of street crime and who believed that the criminal justice system favored criminals at the expense of victims. Moreover, the fact that Willie Horton was black, and that his victims were white, was not lost on most white viewers. 43. How did Dukakis fight back? With facts and figures, he pointed out that Massachusetts was only one of many states with furlough programs and that even the federal government furloughed inmates from its prisons. In addition, he noted, furlough programs were highly effective. The year before, 53,000 inmates received more than 200,000 furloughs, and only a small percentage got into trouble. 44. Dukakis also pointed out that, typically, furloughs were granted to convicts who were near the end of their terms, and that the furloughs were intended to orient them to the outside world. He insisted that the whole issue was a contrivance, that, if elected, George Bush had no intention of changing the furlough system. Are you getting bored yet? So were the voters. If Michael Dukakis had put a social psychologist on his staff, he would have received better advice. When people are scared and angry, facts alone are neither reassuring nor convincing. 45. Information can be effective, but only if it is tied to solutions to problems the voters are deeply concerned about. In the 1992 and 1996 presidential elections, candidate Bill Clinton kept the attention of the American people focused on one overriding issue, the state of the economy, and did not allow himself to be sidetracked by emotional issues. 46. In most American elections, the most successful candidates are those who target strong emotions: fear of crime, disgust at the idea of gay marriage or unisex bathrooms, anger at government bailouts of failed banks, fear of climate change, anger at immigrants for stealing jobs from hardworking Americans, and so on. Candidates have a harder time when they attempt a more reasoned approach, such as explaining the complex economic rationale for bailouts or international trade agreements. The 2016 presidential campaign, arguably the most vulgar in American history, took this focus on fear, anger, and other negative emotions to a new level. At one point, Donald Trump accused Hillary Clinton of being a dangerous criminal who would destroy the country, allow illegal immigrants to take American jobs, admit terrorists, send American jobs to China, and take away people's guns to boot. He called her a nasty woman and intimated that if elected, he would put her in jail. Clinton attacked back hard, mostly by using facts and figures to dispute Trump's allegations. By the end of the campaign, both candidates were demonized to the point that many voters were motivated less by love of their own candidate than by hatred, fear, or disgust for their candidate's monstrous opponent. Education, propaganda, or fake news. What is the difference between propaganda and education? The American Heritage Dictionary of the English Language defines propaganda as the systematic propagation of a given doctrine, and education as the act of imparting knowledge or skill. We can all agree that aspirin ads are propaganda, designed intentionally to mislead consumers into believing that a product with a brand name is better than a generic. Selling a candidate, however, blurs the line. Political consultants display their candidate in a favorable manner, which could conceivably be considered an attempt to educate the public on the policies and virtues of the candidate. But as we saw, their efforts often dismiss factual information in favor of promoting a given doctrine. And what about high school history textbooks that intend to impart knowledge? What knowledge, and from whose point of view? As the old saying goes, history is written by the victors, and until relatively recently, the contributions made by women, blacks, and other minorities to the American story were almost invisible in such books. The fact that school boards around the country still fight furiously over what a history or biology book should say illustrates the thin line between education and propaganda. In practice, whether a person regards a particular course of instruction as educational or propagandistic depends, to a large extent, on his or her moral values and ideology. When my children were in high school, they were required to watch a film about drug abuse, which mentioned that many hardcore narcotics users began their addiction by smoking marijuana. I'm certain that most school officials regarded the presentation of this fact as a case of imparting knowledge, but most recreational marijuana users regarded it as the systematic propagation of a given doctrine, the belief that marijuana invariably leads to the use of harder drugs. Or consider the topic of sex education in the schools as viewed by evangelical Christians or by supporters of Planned Parenthood. One side would regard its teachings about sex as education, and the other side's as propaganda. This is not to say that all communications are drastically slanted and one-sided. Rather, when we are dealing with emotionally charged issues upon which people disagree, it is virtually impossible to construct a communication that people on both sides would agree is fair and impartial. This issue has become thornier with the rise of cable news and the internet, which allow us to choose our preferred sources of information. If you are conservative, you most likely get your news from right-leaning sources like Fox News or websites with a right-wing view of the world. If you are liberal, you most likely get your news from MSNBC or correspondingly left-wing websites. In addition, many of us get our news from social networks like Facebook, which further guarantees that what we see is the result of a filtering process that gives us more of what we already believe. Algorithms generated by our clicking patterns feed our interests and filter out content we find offensive or boring. But the biggest filter is social. When we see mainly what others in our social networks see and like, we are less likely to encounter stories that might challenge, broaden, or change our established worldview. The result is what the internet activist Eli Pariser calls the filter bubble, the personalized universe of information that makes it into our social media feeds and therefore gets our attention. 47 Black and white, religious and secular, liberal and conservative, old and young, urban and rural, each bubble has its own interests and attitudes. The filtering process ensures that we will marinate in news and ideas that we like, with the result that our belief systems are reinforced and others are attacked and ridiculed. And because the filter does this invisibly, we think we are seeing reality instead of a carefully curated version of it. We also think it was always this way, but it wasn't. In 1968, most Americans got their TV news from Walter Cronkite, a veteran war reporter who, as anchor of the CBS Evening News, was widely considered the most trusted man in America. That year, Cronkite famously changed the course of history when, during his evening newscast, he shared his opinion that the Vietnam War was unwinnable. Because most Americans, right and left, trusted Cronkite, their attitudes shifted and public support for the war eroded. It is impossible to imagine a news anchor wielding such broad influence today. 48. Today, anyone with a computer can be a blogger or even start a web-based newspaper or magazine, creating and distributing news with little or no editorial oversight. This capability has led to a proliferation of propaganda in the form of fake news, false stories packaged as true. During the 2016 election, a photo of Donald Trump went viral on the internet, emblazoned with a quote purportedly from years earlier about his presidential ambitions: "If I were to run, I'd run as a Republican." They're the dumbest group of voters in the country. They believe anything on Fox News. I could lie, and they'd still eat it up. I bet my numbers would be terrific. Because this statement felt true to liberals, and echoed sentiments that Trump actually did say, most liberals believed it, despite its being false and repeatedly debunked. The quote continued to circulate on the internet for over a year. 49 An equally false claim also went viral within right-wing circles, alleging that the Democratic candidate, Hillary Clinton, was helping operate a sex trafficking network out of a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. As we saw in Chapter 1, the pizza parlor endured constant harassment and death threats from irate citizens. One such citizen traveled from North Carolina to investigate and ended up shooting several rounds into the restaurant with an assault rifle. Fake news demonstrates an unsettling fact about modern persuasion, because it comes from so many sources and is so easy to package and share as real news. More than ever, people rely on their existing ideas and their social network to determine what to believe. Such an environment encourages the human tendency to categorize information as education if we agree with its implications or as propaganda if we do not. 2 major routes to persuasion. When confronted with a persuasive argument, do we think deeply about it or do we accept it without much thought? This question underlies much of our understanding of persuasion. As we saw in Chapter 2, automatic thinking processes allow us to move through the world without thinking too much. According to Richard Petty and John Cacioppo, 50, we are inclined to think deeply about an issue if it is one that is relevant to us and if we have the required expertise. In these circumstances, we tend to give the argument careful scrutiny. But sometimes, even if the issue is important, we may not process an argument carefully because we are distracted or tired, we lack the knowledge to evaluate it critically, or the communication is presented in a way that lulls us into acceptance. Petty and Cacioppo argue that there are essentially 2 ways that people are persuaded: centrally or peripherally. The central route to persuasion involves weighing arguments and considering relevant facts, thinking about issues in a systematic fashion, and coming to a decision. In contrast, the peripheral route to persuasion is less direct. Rather than weighing and considering the strength of arguments, the person responds to simple, often irrelevant cues that suggest the rightness, wrongness, or attractiveness of an argument without giving it much thought. For example, people who consider the strength of arguments about how to reduce prison recidivism are taking the central route. Those who get scared and angry by the image of Willie Horton are taking the peripheral route. Likewise, if you decide to buy a particular laptop because you've read about its user-friendliness, processing speed, memory, and data storage, you are being moved by the logic of the argument. This is the central route. But if you decide to buy the laptop because your favorite entertainer endorses it, you are being moved by issues irrelevant to the product. This is the peripheral route. Few persuasive appeals are purely central or peripheral, most contain elements aimed at both modes of processing. Central route to persuasion. The route that involves weighing arguments and considering relevant facts and figures, thinking about issues in a systematic fashion, and coming to a decision. Peripheral route to persuasion. The route in which a person responds to simple, often irrelevant cues that suggest the rightness or wrongness of an argument without giving it much thought. Lawyers and politicians often combine central arguments and peripheral cues. In 1995, the murder trial of O.J. Simpson riveted the nation. Millions of viewers tuned in to see the Hall of Fame running back and his dream team of lawyers fight the charges that Simpson had brutally murdered his ex-wife and her friend. In 2016, this story and the trial were retold in an award-winning series, The People v. O.J. Simpson, American Crime Story, and in the documentary O.J., Made in America. In one of the most dramatic moments of the trial, the prosecutor asked Simpson to try on the blood-stained gloves worn by the murderer. Simpson struggled to get the gloves on, but they appeared to be too tight. Simpson's lead attorney, Johnny Cochran, wasted no time in coming up with a memorable line, and in so doing, added a persuasive peripheral cue to the jury. Cochran said, "If it doesn't fit, you must acquit." The statement was persuasive, but not because of the argument's logic. After all, it is certainly possible to commit murder wearing tight gloves, and leather gloves will shrink if soaked in water. But Cochran's statement resonated because when people are evaluating the quality of an argument, they can be influenced by the way it is phrased. In Cochran's case, his rhyme gave the statement a ring of truth. Matthew McGlone 51 demonstrated our susceptibility to such tactics. He found that college students were more persuaded by unfamiliar aphorisms that rhyme than the same ideas presented in non-rhyming form. The peripheral route to persuasion can be surprisingly subtle, yet surprisingly effective. In recent years, choosing the right words has become a science. Politicians and advertisers hire researchers to set up focus groups and conduct surveys to test terms, phrases, and names to see which ones fly best with the public they hope to reach. For example, most Americans are in favor of what used to be called the estate tax, a tax on individuals when they inherit immense wealth from their parents. Public opinion about the estate tax changed when it was renamed by a clever political consultant named Frank Luntz. Luntz's Research 52 suggested that people could be turned against the tax law if politicians began referring to it as a death tax, which conjures the image of being unfairly penalized for dying. Politicians and political action groups routinely give policies nicknames that belie the genuine content of the legislation, depending on whether they want it to succeed or fail. The Affordable Care Act of 2010 nearly failed when a politician charged that a provision in the bill would allow doctors and insurance companies to decide the fate of patients with terminal illnesses. In their attack on the bill, opponents started calling these decision-making meetings death panels, implying that strangers could decide, as one congressman put it, to pull the plug on grandma. In reality, the provision merely required that insurance companies pay for consultation between patients and their doctors to consider options for terminally ill patients, a far cry from the image evoked by the term death panel. Moreover, the ACA itself was given a disparaging title by its opponents, which reduced its popularity: Obamacare. Far more Americans approved of the Affordable Care Act than approved of Obamacare, although it was the same program. In 2001, the United States Department of Agriculture approved a meat additive called lean finely textured beef, intended to stretch out packages of ground beef without increasing its fat content. When ABC News questioned the use of the paste-like additive, which is put in 70% of the ground beef supply in America, it referred to the substance as pink slime. Imagine the public reaction. Petitions to eliminate the substance from school lunches and supermarkets were circulated, and despite its safety, the producers lost customers. Eventually they sued ABC News for over $1 billion. True or false, the pictures that pop into our heads influence our beliefs, feelings, and behaviors, and these images often depend on the specific words we use to label them. Words conjure powerful images and emotions that can overwhelm our consideration of the facts. To sum up, if your aim is to persuade, you need to know how important the issue is to your audience and how well informed they are. If they are knowledgeable and motivated, you will need to include strong, logical arguments in your persuasive appeal. If they don't care about the issue or cannot comprehend it fully, you will need to persuade them by using high-quality peripheral cues that you attach to the message. That might work for a short while, but if you want your persuasive message to stick, experiments suggest that persuasion that gets people to process arguments systematically is much more likely to endure than persuasion based solely on peripheral cues. Point 54. Let's turn now to the 3 key factors that can increase the effectiveness of a communication or persuasive attempt: the source of the communication, the nature of the communication, and the characteristics and mindset of the audience. Put another way, who says what to whom? We will look at each of these separately. The source of the communication. It seems pretty clear that we are most likely to be persuaded by people whom we trust. But what determines trust? Credibility. Many years ago, I saw the poet Allen Ginsberg on a late-night talk show. Ginsberg was among the most popular poets of the so-called Beat generation. His poem, Howl, had scandalized the literary establishment in the 1950s. On the talk show, Ginsberg was at it again. Having just finished boasting about his homosexuality, he was talking about the generation gap, how young and old misunderstand one another. The camera panned in. He was fat, bearded, and looked a trifle wild-eyed. Long hair grew in unruly patches from the sides of his otherwise bald head. He was wearing a tie-dyed t-shirt with a hole in it and a few strands of beads. Although he was talking earnestly, and, in my view, sensibly, about the problems of the young, the studio audience was laughing. They were treating him like a clown. It dawned on me that, in all probability, the vast majority of the people at home, lying in bed watching him, could not possibly take him seriously, no matter how sensible his message and no matter how earnestly he delivered it. His appearance was overwhelming the audience's reaction. The scientist in me longed to replace the wild-eyed Ginsberg with a well-dressed Ivy League professor and have him move his lips while Ginsberg said the same words off camera. My guess is that, under these circumstances, Ginsberg's message would have been well received. No need. Similar experiments have already been done. Indeed, speculations about the effects of prestige on persuasion are ancient. Earlier than 300 years BC, Aristotle, the world's first published social psychologist, wrote, "We believe good men more fully and more readily than others. This is true generally whatever the question is, and absolutely true where exact certainty is impossible and opinions are divided. It is not true, as some writers assume in their treatises on rhetoric, that the personal goodness revealed by the speaker contributes nothing to his power of persuasion. On the contrary, his character may almost be called the most effective means of persuasion he possesses." 55. It took some 2,300 years, but Aristotle's observation was finally put to a scientific test by Karl Hovland and Walter Weiss. 56. They asked large numbers of people to evaluate a claim that building nuclear-powered submarines was a feasible undertaking. Some were informed that the argument was made by a highly credible person, namely J. Robert Oppenheimer, a nationally known and highly respected atomic physicist. Others were informed that the same argument came from a source with low credibility, namely Pravda, the official newspaper of the Communist Party in the then Soviet Union, a publication infamous for its lack of objectivity and truthfulness. Almost everyone who believed that the communication came from Oppenheimer changed their opinions, believing more strongly than they had in the feasibility of nuclear submarines. Very few of those who read the identical prediction attributed to Pravda shifted their opinions. This phenomenon has been repeatedly confirmed by other experimenters using a wide variety of topics and attributing the messages to a wide variety of communicators. A judge in the juvenile court is better than most people at swaying opinion about juvenile delinquency. A famous poet can sway opinion about the merits of a poem, and a medical journal can sway opinion about whether antihistamines should be dispensed without a prescription. What do the physicist, judge, poet, and medical journal have that Pravda didn't have? What makes the difference in their effectiveness? Aristotle said we believe good men, by which he meant people of high moral caliber. Hovland and Weiss use the term credible, which removes the moral connotations present in the Aristotelian definition. The famous physicist, judge, and poet are credible. They are not necessarily good, but they are both expert and trustworthy. It makes sense to allow yourself to be influenced by communicators who are trustworthy and who know what they are talking about. It makes sense for people to be influenced by J. Robert Oppenheimer when he is voicing an opinion about nuclear power, and it makes sense for people who are evaluating the quality of a poem to be influenced by a great poet. But not everyone is equally influenced by the same communicator. Indeed, the same communicator may be regarded by some people as possessing high credibility and by others as possessing low credibility. Moreover, certain peripheral attributes of the communicator may loom large for some members of the audience. Such attributes can make a communicator either effective or ineffective. This phenomenon was demonstrated in an experiment I did with Burton Golden 57, in which 6th grade children listened to a speech extolling the usefulness of arithmetic. The man giving the talk was introduced either as a prize-winning engineer from a prestigious university or as someone who washed dishes for a living. As you might expect, the engineer was far more effective at influencing the youngsters' opinions than the dishwasher was, hardly surprising or even interesting. But in addition, we varied his race. In some of the trials the communicator was white, and in others, black. Several weeks prior to the experiment, the children had filled out a questionnaire designed to measure their degree of prejudice against black people. The results were striking. Among those children who were most prejudiced against blacks, the black engineer was less influential than the white engineer, although both delivered the same speech. Moreover, among those children who were least prejudiced against blacks, the black engineer was more influential than the white engineer. You might think that, in a purely rational world, a prestigious engineer should be able to influence 6th graders about the importance of arithmetic regardless of the color of his or her skin, but as you have been learning throughout this book, this is not a purely rational world. Depending upon the children's racial attitudes, they were either more influenced or less influenced by a black engineer than by an otherwise identical white engineer. This behavior hardly seems adaptive. If the quality of your life depends on the extent to which you allow a communication about arithmetic to influence your opinion, the expertise of the communicator would seem to be the most reasonable factor to heed. To the extent that other factors decrease or increase your susceptibility to Persuasion, you are behaving in a maladaptive manner. But advertisers bank on your irrationality in this respect, counting on irrelevant factors to increase a spokesperson's effectiveness, a cute little gecko to sell you insurance. Frequently, such peripheral cues are the only aspects of the communicator the viewer sees. For decades, ever since the 1950s, the marketers of Wheaties have had famous athletes on their cereal boxes, all enthusiastically endorsing their product. Decathlon champions Bob Richards in the 1960s and Bruce Jenner in the 1970s, gymnast Mary Lou Retton in the 1980s, and later such star athletes as Alex Rodriguez, Michael Phelps, and LeBron James. Apparently, whoever is in charge of selling Wheaties to the masses is convinced that athletes are better than some learned professor of nutrition at being effective communicators. Is this conviction justified? Will people be influenced by an ad just because a prominent sports personality is involved? Even if we admire the skill such athletes display on the playing field, can we trust them to tell us the truth about the products they endorse? After all, we all know that the sports star peddling a particular brand of breakfast cereal or athletic shoes is getting paid handsomely for his or her endorsement. My guess is that most of us would be quick to say, no way. I'm not going to eat Wheaties or buy Nikes just because LeBron says he eats Wheaties and favors Nikes. Maybe other people might be persuaded to run out and buy something just because a sports figure tells them to, but I certainly wouldn't trust even my favorite player's advice on how to spend my hard-earned cash. But can people predict their own behavior? Before you answer, let's take a closer look at the factor of trust. Clearly, trust is important in determining whether a communicator will be effective. For example, perhaps the crucial reason the prejudiced sixth graders in the Aronson and Golden experiment were less influenced by the black engineer than by the white engineer was that they did not trust black people. If this is true, then if we could offer the audience independent evidence that a person is trustworthy, that person should become more persuasive. How might communicators make themselves seem trustworthy to us? One way is to argue against their own self-interest. If people have nothing to gain by convincing us, we will trust them and they will be more effective. An illustration may be helpful. Suppose a habitual criminal, a recently convicted smuggler and peddler of heroin, is giving a talk on the abuses of the U.S. judicial system. Would he influence you? Probably not. Most people would regard him as untrustworthy, outside the Aristotelian definition of a good man, because he has a vested interest in criticizing the system that is punishing him. But suppose he is arguing that the criminal justice system is too lenient on people like him, that criminals almost always beat the rap if they have a smart lawyer, and that even if criminals are convicted, the sentences normally meted out are too soft. Would his argument influence you now? I'm certain it would. Elaine Walster, Darcy Abrahams, and I-58 presented college students with a newspaper clipping of an interview between a news reporter and Joe, the shoulder Napolitano, who was identified as a mobster and hitman. In one experimental condition, Joe, the shoulder, argued for stricter courts and more severe sentences. In another condition, he argued that courts should be more lenient and sentences less severe. We also ran a parallel set of conditions in which the same statements were attributed to a respected public official. When Joe, the shoulder, argued for more lenient courts, he was totally ineffective. In fact, he caused the participants' opinions to change slightly in the opposite direction. But when he argued for stricter, more powerful courts, he was extremely effective as the respected public official delivering the same argument. This study demonstrates that Aristotle was not completely correct. A communicator can be an unattractive, immoral person and still be effective, as long as we believe that he or she has nothing to gain by persuading us. Why was Joe, the shoulder, so effective in our experiment? When people argue against their own self-interest, we infer that the truth of the issue is so compelling that they sincerely believe what they are saying. When Patrick Reynolds, who inherited millions of dollars from the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company, which was founded by his grandfather, took a strong public stand against smoking and encouraged victims of smoking-related illnesses to file lawsuits against tobacco companies, no one disputed his sincerity. 59. And when John Robbins, heir to an enormous fortune from his father's Baskin-Robbins ice cream company. Wrote a best-selling vegan diet book that advocated eliminating dairy products. His argument influenced countless readers. When we argue against our interests, people listen. Another way to increase trustworthiness is to create a situation where people do not think you are trying to persuade them. Many years ago, the brokerage firm E.F. Hutton produced a series of highly successful television commercials. The commercial opens with a shot of two people engaged in private conversation in a noisy, crowded restaurant. When one person begins to pass on some stock advice from E.F. Hutton, a sudden hush falls over the room and everyone, waiters, diners, busboys, is straining toward the speaker to overhear the tip. When E.F. Hutton talks, says the announcer, people listen. The implication is clear. Everyone in the restaurant is getting in on advice that wasn't intended for them, and the information is all the more valuable as a result. When communicators are not trying to influence us, their potential to do so increases. This is exactly what Elaine Walster and Leon Festinger 60 discovered when they staged a conversation between two graduate students in which one of them expressed his expert opinion on an issue. An undergraduate was allowed to overhear their conversation. In one experimental condition, participants knew that the graduate students were aware of their presence in the next room. Therefore, they knew that anything being said could conceivably be intentionally designed to influence their opinion. In the other condition, the situation was arranged so that participants believed the grad students were unaware of their presence in the next room. In this condition, the participants' opinions changed significantly more in the direction of the opinion expressed by the grad students. After all, they knew what they were talking about, and weren't trying to change anyone's mind. Attractiveness and similarity. Where do these findings leave LeBron James urging us to eat Wheaties or wear Nikes? It's obvious that he is trying to influence us. Moreover, he is operating in his own self-interest. Wheaties and Nike are paying him and other famous athletes huge amounts of money to hawk their products. That fact alone should make them less trustworthy. But does it make them less effective? Not necessarily. First, we tend to like and trust people whom we find attractive, so unless we are actively processing the fact that they are being paid to endorse a product, we may be persuaded peripherally. 61 Even though we may not trust the sincerity of the endorsers, that does not mean we don't buy the products they endorse. Attractiveness and likability are powerful factors in persuasion, even if a source lacks expertise or has something to gain from persuading us. Judson Mills Nye 62 did an experiment demonstrating that a beautiful woman, simply because she was beautiful, could have a major impact on the opinions of an audience on a topic wholly irrelevant to her beauty, and further, that her impact was greatest when she openly told the audience she wanted to influence them. Alice Eagley, Shelley Chaikin, and colleagues 63 carried out experiments that not only replicated our finding that more likable communicators are more persuasive but went on to show that we expect beautiful people to think the way we do. No wonder they can persuade us. We associate the attractiveness of the communicator with the desirability of the message. We are influenced by people we like and with whom we perceive similarities. When we like the communicator, we behave as though we were trying to please that person by changing our opinions, but only about trivial issues. Athletes and celebrities can influence our serial choices, and beautiful women and handsome men can get us to agree with them on an abstract topic, whether or not we are willing to admit it. But it is unlikely that they could influence us to support an issue on which we strongly disagree with them, such as gun control or abortion. Finally, we might ask, who is more trustworthy, communicators who state their case with certainty or with apprehension? In most cases, people trust the confident speaker rather than one who hems and haws. They take confidence as an indicator of expertise and truthfulness. However, if we suspect flim-flam, if we are made aware of the likelihood that someone is trying to persuade us to believe something or buy something out of an ulterior motive, that extreme confidence can rouse our suspicions. To summarize, communicators who are most likely to influence us are those we regard as being both expert and trustworthy. That said, their trustworthiness and effectiveness can be increased if they take a position that seems opposed to their self-interest. They do not seem to be trying to influence our opinion. They are especially attractive and appealing, at least where our opinions and not our deep-seated attitudes are concerned. They are confident in their assertions, because confidence increases their credibility, unless we have reasons to doubt their motives. The nature of the communication. Communications themselves differ, and how they differ can determine their effectiveness. Here I want to consider 5 dimensions along which they vary. Is a communication more persuasive if it is designed to appeal to the audience's reasoning ability or if it is aimed at arousing the audience's emotions? Are people more swayed by a communication if it is tied to a compelling personal experience or if it is bolstered by a stack of unimpeachable statistical evidence? Does the communication resonate with the audience's way of seeing themselves, that is, with their basic identity? Should the communication present only one side of the argument or should it also present the opposing view? What is the relationship between the effectiveness of the communication and the discrepancy between the audience's original opinion and the opinion advocated by the communication? Logical versus emotional appeals. As I said earlier, when Donald Trump was campaigning for president, he ran on an emotionally charged platform, fear of immigrants and terrorists and other mysterious foreigners who are coming to get us. He said they are rapists and murderers and bad people. Just as Dukakis could not prevail with his statistics on the success of furlough programs, Clinton could not counter Trump's alarms, which resonated with many sections of the country that were fearing demographic and economic changes. And as we saw in describing the results of the emotion-laden political ads featuring Willie Horton in the Bush-Dukakis campaign, we might suspect that emotional appeals, especially those that generate fear, will be more effective than reasoned ones. Why and when does fear work, and when might it backfire? Years ago, I was living in a community that was about to vote on whether to fluoridate the water supply as a means of combating tooth decay. The proponents of fluoridation launched an information campaign that seemed logical and reasonable, with statements by noted dentists describing the benefits of fluorides and discussing the evidence on the reduction of tooth decay in areas with fluoridated water, as well as statements by physicians and other health authorities that fluoridation has no harmful effects. The opponents of fluoridation used a much more emotional counterargument, passing out leaflets with a picture of an ugly rat, along with the statement, "Don't let them put rat poison in your drinking water." The referendum to fluoridate the water supply was soundly defeated. This story does not prove conclusively that fear appeals are superior, because it was not a scientifically controlled study. We have no idea how people would have voted on fluoridation if no publicity were circulated, nor do we know whether the anti-fluoridation circular reached more people or whether it was easier to read than the proponents' literature. In one early study of voting preferences, George Hartman's 64 demonstrated that individuals who received a primarily emotional message voted for the candidate endorsed by the message more often than did people who received a primarily logical message. I emphasize the word primarily for good reason. It defines the major problem with research in this area, namely, that there are no foolproof, mutually exclusive definitions of emotional and rational. In the fluoridation illustration, most people would probably agree the anti-fluoridation pamphlet was designed to arouse fear, yet it was not entirely illogical, because it is indeed true that the fluoride used in minute concentrations to prevent tooth decay is also used in massive concentrations as a rat poison. On the other side, presenting the views of professional people is not entirely free from emotional appeal. It's comforting to know that physicians and dentists endorse the use of fluorides. Because, in practice, operational distinctions between logical and emotional are difficult to draw, some researchers have turned to an equally interesting and far more researchable problem, the problem of the effect of various levels of a specific emotion on opinion change. Suppose you wish to arouse fear in the hearts of your audience as a way of getting them to change their minds. Would it be more effective to arouse just a little fear, or should you try to scare the hell out of them? If your goal is to convince people to drive more carefully, without texting, would you be more effective if you showed them films of the broken and bloody bodies of victims of highway accidents? Or would you be more effective if you soft-pedaled your communication, showing crumpled fenders, discussing increased insurance rates due to careless driving, and pointing out that people who drive carelessly may have their driver's licenses suspended? Common sense is no help here. On the one hand, it suggests that a good scare will motivate people to act. On the other hand, it argues that too much fear can interfere with a person's ability to pay attention to the message, to comprehend it, and to act upon it. We've all believed, at one time or another, that, it only happens to the other guy, it can't happen to me. That's why some people continue to drive and text or to insist on driving after they've had a few drinks, even though they know better. Perhaps this is because the risks of accidents are so alarming that people put them out of their minds. Thus we might predict that if a communication really frightens us, we tend not to pay close attention to it. What does the evidence tell us? The overwhelming weight of experimental data suggests that, all other things being equal, the more frightened a person is by a communication, the more likely he or she is to take preventive action. In one of many experiments on fear and persuasion, Howard Leventhal and his associate 65 tried to induce people to stop smoking cigarettes and to get chest X-rays. In the low fear condition, some participants were simply given a recommendation to stop smoking and get X-rayed. In the moderate fear condition, others were shown a film depicting a young man whose X-rays revealed he had lung cancer. And in the high fear condition, people saw the same film but also another, more gory film of a lung cancer operation. Those who were most frightened were also most eager to stop smoking and most likely to get X-rays. Is this true for everyone? It is not. There is a reason why common sense suggests that fear blocks us from acting. It does, for certain people, under certain conditions. What, certain people, for example? Leventhal and his colleagues discovered that people who had a high opinion of themselves were most likely to be motivated to take immediate action when they were frightened. People with a low opinion of themselves, however, were least likely to take immediate action, but if there was a delay and they knew they could take action later, they behaved much like the participants. With high self-esteem. People with negative self-images may have difficulty coping with threats, which explains why a high fear communication overwhelms them and makes them feel like crawling into bed and pulling the covers up over their heads. They can deal more easily with low or moderate fear at the moment. But if given time, that is, if it's not essential that they act immediately, they will be more likely to act if the message truly scares the hell out of them. Subsequent research by Leventhal and his co-workers supports this analysis. In one study, participants watched films of serious automobile accidents. Some watched the films on a large screen up close, which made the images really alarming. Others watched them from far away on a much smaller screen. Among the participants with high or moderate self-esteem, those who saw the films on the large screen were much more likely to take subsequent protective action than were those who saw the films on the small screen. The reverse pattern applied to people with low self-esteem. They were more likely to act when they saw the films on a small screen. Those who saw the films on a large screen couldn't cope and tuned out, saying they had difficulty even thinking of themselves as victims of auto accidents. Yet even people with high self-esteem will behave like people with low self-esteem if they are overwhelmed with fear and feel there is nothing they can do to prevent or manage a threatening situation. In that case, most of them will get into that bed and search for the blanket. How, then, would you motivate people with low self-esteem if you wanted them to give up smoking or drive more safely? If you construct a message containing specific, optimistic instructions, it might make them more likely to believe they could confront their fears and cope with the danger. Indeed, Leventhal and his associates found that fear-arousing messages containing specific instructions about how, when, and where to take action are much more effective than generalized alarms with no recommendations for dealing with them. For example, a campaign conducted on a college campus urging students to get tetanus shots was divided into two conditions: instructions only, where and when they were available, along with the location of the student health service and a suggestion that each student set aside a convenient time to stop by, and instructions plus a high fear appeal. Describing the awful things that can happen to you if you don't get a protective tetanus shot. The instructions on their own increased the students' favorable attitudes toward tetanus shots and increased their stated intentions to get one. But instructions weren't enough to get them to do it. Fear was the necessary shot in the arm, so to speak. Of the students who were frightened about what might happen to them if they didn't have a tetanus shot and who were instructed about how and where to get one, 28% got the tetanus shots, but of those who received no specific instructions or a high fear appeal, only 3% did. Similarly, Leventhal found that scaring smokers about the dangers of nicotine increased their intention to stop smoking. But unless that message was accompanied by recommendations about how to quit, it didn't change the smokers' behavior. Conversely, giving them specific things they could do when they had the urge to smoke, but without scaring them about health risks, was relatively ineffective. The combination of fear arousal and specific instructions produced the best results. For months later, the students in this condition were smoking less. And yet, there are some situations in which fear-arousing appeals, even when coupled with specific instructions, will not produce the desired effect. Sometimes fear appeals fail because they are not scary enough. Global warming, for example, is a serious threat that most scientists believe is a ticking time bomb. As temperatures rise, glaciers are melting and sea levels are rising, which means that many population centers will be underwater in the coming years. Certain diseases, like malaria, will proliferate when the insects that carry them migrate to formerly cool places. Hurricanes will continue to become more frequent and intense, as will droughts and heat waves, killing people and imperiling the production of food. Yet despite these grim predictions, which were graphically depicted in the Oscar-winning movie An Inconvenient Truth, most Americans remain insufficiently frightened to demand action. A 2016 survey of American Fears 66 found that people are more afraid of terrorism, identity theft, and biological warfare than they are of global warming. Why might this be? Daniel Gilbert 67 suggests that part of the answer lies in the way our brains work. Our brains evolved to be frightened and riled to action by threats of clear and present dangers, not gradual ones that might happen later. We are also disposed to respond to human threats that are intentional and thus arouse in us a sense of moral indignation. However, because climate change has the potential to inflict suffering and death on far more millions of people than terrorism does, ignoring or denying it is dangerously maladaptive for our species and our planet. Gilbert suggests that people would be far more likely to demand action on global warming if it were seen as a plot by terrorists instead of the unfortunate byproduct of driving cars, burning coal, and cutting down forests. Perhaps more people would be inclined to take action if, like the stereotypical terrorist, global warming had a mustache and was intentionally coming after us like a predator. Matthew McGlone and his colleagues 68 tested this proposition, not by putting a mustache on global warming, but by putting one on another non-human threat, the swine flu virus that became a pandemic in 2009. In April of that year, in response to the rapidly spreading flu, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention made a series of recommendations, including frequent hand washing, avoiding contact with infected individuals, and above all, getting vaccinated. In the experiment, after these recommendations had been made but before the vaccine became available, McGlone and his team created informational pamphlets that varied in the way they presented facts about the swine flu. For half the people in the experiment, the flu was depicted as something that people contract. For the other half, the language was changed to depict the flu as a predator. People who received the pamphlet that described the flu as an active killer were significantly more likely to see the swine flu as frightening, more likely to see themselves as susceptible to it, and more likely to schedule a flu shot. Thus, fear-inducing appeals are especially effective if they resonate with our evolutionary programming to fear being attacked by a threat that feels immediate and intentional. Moral emotions are feelings that have a normative judgment. What you are doing is wrong, disgusting, or evil. Anger, for example, is both a feeling and a judgment. I feel angry because of the evil thing you have done. Moral emotions can be highly persuasive rhetorical devices. They tend to inspire action and unite like-minded communities, and they tend to be contagious. 69, for example, on Twitter, tweets that contain words associated with moral emotions tend to be retweeted more often than non-moral emotion words. 70 politicians often try to inspire moral outrage because it unites their followers and gets them to sign petitions, donate money, and get off their butts to vote against whatever is claimed to be the reason for their outrage. 71 charities often try to persuade people to donate money to the less fortunate by making potential donors feel guilty, an emotion that increases their intentions to contribute money and help in face-to-face situations. 72. We can also be persuasive by appealing to people's better angels, their pro-social motivation, through moral elevation, the emotion we feel when we witness virtue in others. Experiment 73 find that when people watch videos depicting real-life acts of kindness or moral beauty, such as a teacher who goes the extra mile for her students, or a poor child who gives money to a less fortunate child, they are many times more likely to say yes to a request for help or money from another person. In a similar vein, Adam Grant has studied the effects of different kinds of incentives for getting people to work hard. 74 In one of his studies, he examined the productivity of volunteers making cold calls to raise money for student scholarships. Grant discovered a lovely technique that persuaded his volunteer callers to nearly triple the donations they got. All he had to do was arrange a 5-minute meeting between the volunteers and a past recipient of one of the fellowships they were soliciting for. Being able to connect their efforts to a human being, who expressed the moral emotion of gratitude, energized their fundraising efforts. Statistics versus a personal example. Generally speaking, people use others' experiences and opinions to make decisions about what is a good course of action. That is why, as a general rule, we trust large groups of people more than a single person and are more inclined to follow the crowd than a single nonconformist. But this reasonable logic often goes out the window when we are faced with a compelling story or example. If Yelp has 300 positive reviews praising El Taco Loco, but only 2 negative ones, it's statistically likely that you'll enjoy the restaurant too. But let's say that you overhear someone at a party talking about a terrible experience they just had there. Will you say, well, okay, that's one of the 2 unhappy customers out of the 300 ecstatic ones? Perhaps, but that one personal story is likely to overwhelm the preponderance of positive Yelp reviews. And the more vivid those personal stories are, the more persuasive they are. 75. A real-life demonstration comes from the area of energy conservation. Several years ago, my students and I 76 set out to persuade homeowners to make the improvements necessary to have an energy-efficient house. We worked with home auditors from local utility companies and taught them to use vivid examples when recommending home improvements. Most auditors, when left to their own devices, would merely point to cracks around doors and recommend that the homeowner install weather stripping. Instead, we trained them to tell homeowners that if all the cracks around all the doors were added up, they would equal a hole the size of a basketball in their living room wall. And if you had a hole that size in your wall, wouldn't you want to patch it up? That's what weather stripping does. Auditors trained to use such lively language increased their effectiveness fourfold. Whereas previously only 15% of the homeowners had the recommended work done, after the auditors began to use more vivid language, 61% of the homeowners did. Because most people are more deeply influenced by one personal example than by an abundance of statistical data, your friend's Taco Loco story or the thought of a basketball-sized hole in your living room will probably be extraordinarily powerful. This is undoubtedly one reason that testimonials are so effective, even when they are accompanied by statistical disclaimers. It is also the reason that professional lobbyists are trained in how to persuade members of Congress to vote for some bill. Don't present a lot of statistics, they are warned, just tell an emotional story about one individual. Appeals to identity. A persuader can get us to do things if those things resonate with our self-identity. One of the most charming examples comes from a highly successful ad campaign that the state of Texas developed to get its citizens to stop littering. Rather than put up signs saying, "Don't litter," the Texas Department of Transportation crafted a slogan that tapped into the pride and sense of frontier "don't tread on me" toughness that Texans are known for. Don't mess with Texas. The phrase was prominently displayed on highways, television, radio, and print ads, and it worked. Litter on Texas highways dropped roughly 72% between 1986 and 1990.77. Invoking a person's identity can thus have subtle but powerful effects. Christopher Bryan and his colleagues 78 have shown that people are much more likely to vote if you change the phrasing of a pre-election survey question from one about action to one about fulfilling an identity that people approve of. Similarly, children helped more when they were asked, "Who wants to be a helper?" rather than, "Who wants to help?" Such labels can reduce bad behavior as well. And as we saw in Chapter 3, people cheat less when prompted with the warning, "Don't be a cheater," instead of being asked not to cheat. By getting people to think of an action, good or bad, in terms of their larger identity, they see the action as something central to who they are rather than as an occasional action. Such is the power of identity. Point 79. One-sided versus two-sided arguments. Suppose you are about to make a speech attempting to persuade your audience that capital punishment is necessary. Would you persuade more people if you just stated your view and ignored the arguments against capital punishment, or would you be more persuasive if you discussed the opposing arguments and attempted to refute them? Before trying to answer this question, let's look at what is involved. If a communicator mentions the opposition's arguments, it might indicate that he or she is an objective, fair-minded person. This could enhance the speaker's trustworthiness and thus increase his or her effectiveness. But if a communicator so much as mentions the arguments on the other side of the issue, it might suggest to the audience that the issue is controversial. This could confuse them, make them vacillate, and would ultimately reduce the persuasiveness of the communication. And, in fact, there is no simple relation between one-sided arguments and their effectiveness. If audience members are well informed about the topic, the less likely they are to be persuaded by a one-sided argument and the more likely they are to be persuaded by an argument that brings out the important opposing arguments and then proceeds to refute them. This makes sense. A well-informed person is more likely to know some of the counterarguments. When the communicator avoids mentioning them, the knowledgeable members of the audience are likely to conclude that the communicator is either being unfair or is unable to refute them. In contrast, an uninformed person knows little or nothing about opposing arguments, so they are likely to be persuaded by the side they hear. If they hear the counterargument, they may get confused about which position to agree with. Another factor is the initial position of the audience. If the audience is already predisposed to believe the communicator's argument, a one-sided presentation has a stronger impact on their opinion than a two-sided presentation. If, however, the audience is leaning in the opposite direction, then a two-sided refutation is more persuasive. Point 80. Most politicians are well aware of this phenomenon, which is why they tend to present vastly different kinds of speeches, depending upon the audience. When talking to the party faithful, they almost invariably deliver a hell-raising set of arguments favoring their own party platform and candidacy. If they do mention the opposition, it is in a derisive, mocking tone. But when they are appearing on television or speaking to an audience of mixed loyalties, they tend to take a more diplomatic position, giving the opposing view a reasonably accurate airing before proceeding to demolish it. The size of the discrepancy between communicator and audience. Suppose you are talking to people who strongly disagree with your point of view. Will you be more effective if you present your position in its most extreme form, or if you modulate your position by presenting it in such a way that it does not seem terribly different from your audience's position? Let's say you believe that people should exercise vigorously every day to stay healthy. Any physical activity would be helpful, but at least an hour's worth would be preferable. Your audience consists of college professors who seem to believe that turning the pages of a book is sufficient exercise for the average person. Would you be more likely to change their opinion by arguing that they should begin a rigorous daily program of running, weight training, and yoga, or by suggesting a briefer, less taxing regimen? What is the most effective level of discrepancy between the opinion of the audience and the recommendation of the communicator? This is a vital issue for any propagandist or educator. At first the answer seemed obvious: the greater the discrepancy, the greater their opinion change should be. This line of reasoning would suggest that the communicator should argue for the daily program of rigorous exercise. The greater the discrepancy with the listener's behavior, the more they should change their opinion. Indeed, several investigators have found that this linear relation holds true. Philip Zimbardo, 81, recruited college women for an experiment, asking each one to bring a close friend with her to the laboratory. Each pair of friends was presented with a case study of a teenager who had committed a crime, and then each of the participants was asked, separately and in private, to indicate her recommendations on the matter. Each participant was led to believe her close friend disagreed with her, either by a small margin or by an extremely large margin. Zimbardo found that the greater the apparent discrepancy, the more the participants changed their opinions toward what they supposed were the opinions of their friends. However, some experiments failed to support this result. James Whittaker, 82, found a curvilinear relation between discrepancy and opinion change. By curvilinear, I mean that, as a small discrepancy increased somewhat, so did the degree of opinion change. But as the discrepancy continued to increase, opinion change began to slacken, and finally, as the discrepancy became large, the amount of opinion change became very small. When the discrepancy was very large, almost no opinion change was observed. Intrigued by this finding, Carl Hovland, O. J. Harvey, and Muzaffar Sharif 83 argued that if a particular communication differs too much from your own position, if it is, in effect, outside of your latitude of acceptance, you will not be much influenced by it. In their experiment, the communication was based on a red-hot issue, one the participants felt strongly about, whether their state should remain dry or go wet, that is, whether or not to change the law prohibiting the distribution and sale of alcoholic beverages. The voters in that state were divided on this issue, and the participants were a representative sample. Some felt strongly that the state should remain dry, others felt strongly that it should go wet, and the rest took a moderate position. The participants were divided into groups of people reflecting all three positions and then presented with arguments supporting one of the three opinions: a wet message, which argued for the unlimited and unrestricted sale of liquor, a dry message, which argued for complete prohibition, and a moderately wet message, which argued to allow some drinking but with certain controls and restrictions. Thus, each group consisted of participants who found the communication close to their own position, found it moderately discrepant from their own position, and found it extremely discrepant from their own position. The most opinion change occurred when there was a moderate discrepancy between the message and the opinion of individual members. For a scientist, this is an exciting state of affairs. When a substantial number of research findings points in one direction and a substantial number points in a different direction, it doesn't necessarily mean someone has to be wrong. Rather, it suggests there is a significant factor that hasn't been accounted for, and this is indeed exciting, for it gives the scientist an opportunity to play detective. That's why I want to dwell on this issue, not only for its substantive value, but also because it provides an opportunity to demonstrate the adventurous aspect of social psychology as a science. There are two ways of proceeding with this game of detective. We can begin by assembling all the experiments that show one result and all those that show the other result and then painstakingly scrutinizing them, looking for the one factor common to the experiments in Group A and lacking in Group B. Next we can try to determine, conceptually, why this factor should make a difference. Or we can begin by speculating about what factor or factors might make a difference. Then we can glance through the existing literature, with this conceptual lantern in hand, to see if those in Group A differ from those in Group B on this dimension. As a scientist, my personal preference is for the second mode. Accordingly, with my students Judith Turner and Merrill Carl Smith, I began to speculate about what factors might make a difference. We began by accepting the notion that the greater the discrepancy, the greater the discomfort for the members of the audience. But, we reasoned, this does not necessarily mean the members of an audience will change their opinion. Consider this situation from the audience's point of view. As we saw in discussing cognitive dissonance, when someone comes along who disagrees with us, it makes us feel uncomfortable because it suggests our opinions or actions may be wrong or based on misinformation, or maybe, God forbid, that we're incompetent or foolish. The greater the gap between what the other person says and what we believe, the greater our dissonance. How can individuals reduce this dissonance? There are at least three ways. They can change their opinion. They can seek support for their original opinion by finding other people who share their views, in spite of what the communicator says. Or they can disparage the communicator, convince themselves the person is incompetent, immoral, or a blithering nitwit, and thereby invalidate his or her opinion. Technically, there's a fourth way. They can induce the communicator to change his or her opinion, but that's not possible if the message is delivered by someone who is not approachable. Under what circumstances would an individual find it easy or difficult to choose option 3 and denigrate the communicator? It would be difficult to do that with a liked and respected personal friend. It would also be difficult to dismiss someone who is a highly trustworthy expert on the issue under discussion. But if the communicator's credibility were questionable, we predicted that denigrating or dismissing that person would be the route that most people would take, especially if his or her opinion were extremely different from the listener's. The more discrepant the communicator's position is from that of the audience, the more the audience might begin to question his or her wisdom, intelligence, and sanity. And the more they question his or her wisdom, intelligence, and sanity, the less likely they are to be influenced. Let's return to our example involving physical exercise. Imagine a 73-year-old man who had just won the Boston Marathon. If he told me that a good way to stay in condition and live a long, healthy life was to exercise vigorously for at least 2 hours every day, I would believe him. Boy, would I believe him. He would get much more exercise out of me than if he suggested I should exercise for only 10 minutes a day. But suppose a less credible person, such as a high school track coach, suggested I exercise 10 minutes a day. This time his suggestion would be within my own latitude of acceptance, and he might influence my opinion and behavior. But if he advised me to embark on a program of vigorous exercise, requiring 2 hours every day, I would be inclined to write him off as a quack or a health nut, and I could comfortably continue being lazy. Thus, I would agree with Hovland, Harvey, and Sharif. People will consider an extremely discrepant communication to be outside their latitude of acceptance, but only if the communicator is not highly credible. Armed with these speculations, Turner, Carl Smith, and I scrutinized the existing experiments on this issue, paying special attention to the ways in which the communicator was described. Lo and behold, we discovered that each of the experiments showing a direct linear relation between discrepancy and opinion change happened to describe the source of the communication as more credible than did those whose results showed a curvilinear relation. This confirmed our speculations about the role of credibility. But we didn't stop there. We constructed an experiment in which we systematically investigated the size of the discrepancy and the credibility of the communicator within one research design. 84 In this experiment, college women were asked to read several stanzas from obscure modern poetry and rank them in terms of how good they were. Then each woman was asked to read a criticism of modern poetry that specifically mentioned a stanza she had rated as poor. For some participants, the essayist described this particular stanza in glowing terms. This created a large discrepancy between the opinion of the communicator and the opinion voiced by the students. For other participants, the essayist was only mildly favorable in the way he described the stanza. This set up a moderate discrepancy between the essayist and the students. In a third condition, the essayist was mildly scornful in his treatment of the stanza, which placed the recipients of this communication in a mild discrepancy situation. Finally, for half of the women in the experiment, the writer of the essay was identified as the renowned poet T.S. Eliot. For the other half, the writer was identified as a college student. Now all of the women ranked the stanzas once again. When they thought Eliot had written the essay, he had the most influence on their assessment when his evaluation of the stanza was most discrepant from theirs. When they thought a fellow student of medium credibility was the essayist, his views produced little opinion change when it was slightly discrepant from the opinion of the students, more change when it was moderately discrepant, and only a little opinion change when it was extremely discrepant. What, then, can we conclude about the interaction between a communicator's credibility and the audience's beliefs? When communicators have high credibility, the more likely it is that an audience will be persuaded by their arguments if there is a great discrepancy between the communicator's view and that of the audience. But when communicators have low credibility, the only way they will get an audience to go along is if their view is only moderately different from that of the audience. Characteristics of the audience. People differ, some are more difficult to persuade. In addition, as we have seen, the kind of communication that appeals to one person may not appeal to another. I have already noted that the amount of knowledge, ability, and motivation that audience members possess, as well as their prior opinions, will play major roles in determining whether a two-sided communication will be more effective than a one-sided communication. Personality and politics. What effect does an individual's personality have on his or her openness to being persuaded? One personality trait that is most consistently related to persuasibility is self-esteem. Individuals who feel inadequate are more easily influenced by a persuasive communication than individuals who think highly of themselves. 85 This seems reasonable enough. After all, if people don't like themselves, then it follows that they don't place a high premium on their own ideas and have less confidence in their convictions. Consequently, if their ideas are challenged, they may be willing to give them up. If Emily, who has high self-esteem, listens to a communication at variance with her own opinion, she must make up her mind whether she stands a better chance of being right if she changes her opinion or stands pat. She may experience even more conflict if she finds herself in disagreement with a highly credible communicator. But if she has low self-esteem, she would feel little or no conflict. Because she doesn't think much of herself, she probably believes she stands a better chance of being right if she goes along with the communicator. Anyone who is awake nowadays knows that Republicans and Democrats seem to disagree on most issues, and neither side seems able to be persuaded by the other. Why? After analyzing the data from 44 years of studies and more than 22,000 people in the United States and Europe, John Jost and his associates 86 have concluded that these disagreements are not simply philosophic disputes about how, say, to end poverty or fix schools. They reflect different ways of thinking, different levels of tolerance for uncertainty, and core personality traits, which is why conservatives and liberals are usually not persuaded by the same kinds of arguments. As a result of such evidence, some evolutionary psychologists maintain that ideological belief systems may have evolved in human societies to be organized along a left-right dimension, consisting of two core sets of attitudes, whether a person advocates social change or supports the system as it is, and whether a person thinks inequality is a result of human policies and can be overcome or is inevitable and should be accepted as part of the natural order. 87 evolutionary psychologists point out that both sets of attitudes would have had adaptive benefits over the millennia. Conservatism would have promoted stability, tradition, order, and the benefits of hierarchy, whereas liberalism would have promoted rebelliousness, change, flexibility, and the benefits of equality. 88 conservatives prefer the familiar, liberals prefer the unusual. Every society, to survive, would have done best with both kinds of citizens, but you can see why liberals and conservatives argue so emotionally over issues such as income inequality and gay marriage. They are not only arguing about the specific issue, but also about underlying assumptions and values that emerge from their personality traits. It is important to stress that these are general tendencies. Most people enjoy stability and change in their lives, perhaps in different proportion at different ages. Many people will change their minds in response to new situations and experiences, as was the case in the acceptance of gay marriage, and until relatively recently in American society. The majority of members of both political parties were willing to compromise and seek common ground in passing legislation. Still, such differences in basic orientation help explain the frustrating fact that liberals and conservatives so rarely succeed in hearing one another, let alone in changing one another's minds. The mood and mindset of the audience. Another factor that affects how audiences will react to a communicator's message is their frame of mind. Robert Cialdini, who has studied persuasion both in the laboratory and by working with sales and persuasion experts, argues that how you prepare people for a persuasive message is a critical factor in whether persuasion works, by guiding preliminary attention strategically. It's possible for a communicator to move recipients into agreement with a message before they experience it. 89 For example, in one study, when researchers approached individuals and asked for help with a marketing survey, only 29% agreed to participate. But when the researchers approached individuals and preceded that request with a simple, "Do you consider yourself a helpful person?" 77.3% later volunteered. Why? When asked before the request if they were helpful, nearly everyone answered yes. Then, when the request was made, most agreed to participate in order to be consistent with the recently activated identity of themselves as helpful people. Because people like to see themselves as helpful, it makes it difficult, dissonance arousing, to answer yes and then refuse to help. Listeners are also more receptive to a persuasive communication if they are well-fed, relaxed, happy, and feeling good about themselves. People who have been allowed to eat food they enjoy while reading a persuasive message are more influenced by what they read than are people in a control group. 90 And being in a good mood can make people more vulnerable to persuasion by making them less critical. 91 Jeffrey Cohen, Joshua Aronson, and Claude Steele 92 found that people who had been given some self-affirming feedback were significantly more receptive to persuasive arguments attacking their beliefs. Conversely, members of an audience can be made to be less receptive and less persuadable. One way is simply to warn them about what's coming. 93 When I was a young man, TV hosts would pause in the proceedings and say, "And now, a message from our sponsor." Even then, I thought that announcement would render the sponsor's message less persuasive than it would have been if the show had glided into it without prologue. The forewarning seems to say, "Watch out, I'm going to try to persuade you," and people tend to respond by marshalling defenses against the message. This phenomenon was demonstrated in an experiment by Jonathan Friedman and David Sears. 94 Teenagers were told they would be hearing a talk entitled, "Why Teenagers Should Not Be Allowed to Drive." 10 minutes later, the speaker presented them with a prepared talk. In a control condition, he gave the same talk without the 10-minute forewarning. The teenagers in the control condition were more thoroughly convinced by what he said than were those who had been forewarned. Resisting propaganda and persuasion. Let's end this chapter as we began, thinking about all the techniques and technologies now in play to persuade us to buy something, believe some claim, or do something to improve our lives. Fortunately, although all of us can be influenced by methods we are usually unaware of, notably, the familiar drumbeat of repetition, the evocation of fear, or appeals to aspects of our identities that matter most to us, we human beings are not sponges, passively absorbing whatever is poured into us. We want to maintain our sense of control and protect our sense of freedom. According to Jack Brem's theory of reactance 95, when our sense of freedom is threatened, we attempt to restore it. Have you ever been warned sternly not to do something? Don't touch this hot plate. Don't go out with that person. Don't smoke grass, and then promptly did it anyway? That's reactance. When people think that someone's message is too blatant or coercive, thereby intruding on their freedom of choice, they likely activate their defenses to resist it. For example, if I wander into a store just to browse and an aggressive salesperson tells me I must try this aftershave or must look at their line of trendy new shirts, my first reaction is to reassert my independence by leaving the store. Reactance. When our sense of freedom is threatened and we attempt to restore it. Studies have demonstrated reactance across a wide range of activities. In an attempt to get people to stop writing graffiti on restroom walls, researchers placed one of two signs in the bathrooms, 96, "Do not write on these walls under any circumstances," or "Please don't write on these walls." The researchers returned 2 weeks later and observed how much graffiti had been written in the interval. As predicted, significantly more people wrote graffiti when the "Do not write" sign instructed them not to, than with the "Please don't write" sign. Likewise, smokers who receive stern warnings telling them not to smoke typically respond by lighting up in protest. 97. Or suppose that, as you walk down the street, you are politely asked to sign a petition. You don't know much about the issue, and as it is being explained to you, another person approaches and vigorously advises you not to sign. Reactance theory predicts that, to counteract this pressure and reassert a freedom of choice, you would be more likely to sign. This scenario was actually staged by Madeline Heilman, 98, who found that, under most circumstances, the more intense the attempts to prevent people from signing the petition, the more likely they were to sign. Of course, as we have seen in Chapter 4, people can be influenced to comply with implicit social pressures, as in the Ash experiment. But when those pressures are so blatant that they threaten people's feeling of freedom, they not only resist them, but they tend to react in the opposite direction. In fact, all other things being equal, when faced with information that runs counter to important beliefs, people have a tendency, whenever feasible, to invent counterarguments on the spot. In this way, they are able to prevent their opinions from being unduly influenced and protect their sense of autonomy. On a personal level, therefore, reactance leads us to counteract orders or instructions telling us how we must behave. But there is a better, more mindful way to resist persuasion. We have already seen that a two-sided, pro and con presentation is more effective for convincing most audiences than a one-sided presentation. Expanding on this phenomenon, William McGuire and his associates developed what they called the inoculation effect. 99 When people receive a brief communication that they are then able to refute, they tend to be immunized against a subsequent full-blown presentation of the same argument. In much the same way that a small amount of a weakened virus immunizes people against a full-blown attack by that virus. By taking small doses of arguments against their position, people become immune to later, more powerful arguments against their original opinions. In contrast, if people have not thought much about the issue, that is, if they formed their attitudes via the peripheral route, such as through emotions, familiarity, or peers, they are particularly susceptible to a full-blown attack on their position. They will have had no practice in defending their views. That's why one experiment found that inoculating people with the facts about 9/11 increased their resistance to subsequent conspiracy theory propaganda about that tragedy. 100. Inoculation effect. The process of making people immune to attempts to change their attitudes, by initially exposing them to small doses of the arguments against their position. Inoculation increases our resistance to later persuasion because we become motivated to defend our beliefs, and we gain some practice in defending them by being forced to examine why we hold them. Of course, sometimes being open to criticism and a reasoned argument by the opposition might lead to a better alternative, changing our minds. The larger point, in my view, is crucial to the very purpose of education. If we want to lessen the impact of simplistic propaganda, there is no substitute for free inquiry into ideas of all kinds. The person who is easiest to brainwash is the person whose beliefs are based on slogans that have never been seriously challenged. For me, the upshot of this research is that having our ideas challenged can have great benefits, either by convincing us that some of our cherished beliefs might be wrong, or by forcing us to think about the reasons for our beliefs and understand those reasons on a deeper level than we had ever done before. That is why I have been saddened to read the stories of protests on college campuses over speakers considered racist, or sexist, or any other ist. These speakers might well be prejudiced, but they might also be people who simply disagree with their protesters in some ways but not all. How would anyone know until they hear them speak freely? As the research on persuasion in this chapter shows, forbidding people to speak accomplishes nothing. It doesn't teach the protesters how to marshal persuasive arguments for their position, it doesn't persuade the person whose opinions differ. And it doesn't help resolve cultural misunderstandings and miscommunication. My work as a social psychologist and professor persuades me that it is vital, especially on college campuses, to invite speakers who disagree with the prevalent beliefs and attitudes of the student body, even if many students find those arguments offensive. Shouting and silencing do not persuade anyone of anything. Lisa Feldman Barrett, a psychologist who studies the neuroscience of emotion, tells a story that I think beautifully captures the difference between distasteful speech and abusive speech. Entertaining someone else's distasteful perspective can be educational. Early in my career, I taught a course that covered the eugenics movement, which advocated the selective breeding of humans. Eugenics, in its time, became a scientific justification for racism. To help my students understand this ugly part of scientific history, I assigned them to debate its pros and cons. The students refused. No one was willing to argue, even as part of a classroom exercise, that certain races were genetically superior to others. So I enlisted an African American faculty member in my department to argue in favor of eugenics while I argued against. Halfway through the debate, we switched sides. We were modeling for the students a fundamental principle of a university education, as well as civil society. When you're forced to engage a position you strongly disagree with, you learn something about the other perspective as well as your own. The process feels unpleasant, but it's a good kind of stress. And you reap the longer-term benefits of learning. 101. In contrast, provocateurs, propagandists, and hate-mongers, such as advocates for the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist groups, are engaging in abusive speech. They are not remotely interested in educating anyone or debating their ideas, so there is no reason to invite them to speak at an educational institution. But they should not be lumped in the same category as serious scholars with whom we happen to disagree, such as the political scientist Charles Murray, who has long argued that genetic factors help account for racial disparities in IQ scores. That argument offends many people, but it is an empirical hypothesis that can be debated and is data examined. And that process, in turn, can lead, and has led, to further experimental investigation to determine why Murray got the results he did and whether other explanations might account for them. In science, we don't get to say, "I don't like your findings because they go against my values," and leave the room, slamming the door behind us. We are obligated to use evidence to make a case for why we think they are wrong. In Chapter 7 you will see how Murray's arguments have been disputed by social psychologists such as Claude Steele and Joshua Aronson and by geneticists such as Richard Lewontin. John Stuart Mill was right on target when, in his famous 1859 essay, On Liberty, he asserted that we must allow for the expression of ideas we dislike because they may contain some grain of truth that can question and perhaps even correct the prevailing conventional wisdom or, at the very least, provide us with the motivation to re-examine the wisdom of the beliefs to which we had always adhered. Or, as Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis put it, when we confront ideas based on fallacies and falsehoods, we must remember that the remedy to be applied is more speech, not enforced silence. Education is sometimes disquieting, which is as it should be. 6. Human aggression. Saul Steinberg, Untitled Drawing, Ink on Paper. Originally published in The New Yorker, January 18, 1964. The person on the horse is wearing a cap that has a bird-shaped accent. A flag on a pole and a rod with a C-shaped arm and spikes on the top are also seen behind the rider. Many years ago, at the height of the disastrous war our country was waging in Southeast Asia, I was watching the news on television. The anchorman was reporting an incident in which U.S. planes dropped napalm on a village in South Vietnam, believed to be a Viet Cong stronghold. My son Hal, who was about 10 years old at the time, asked brightly, "Hey, Dad, what's napalm?" "Oh," I answered casually, "as I understand it, it's a chemical that burns people. It also sticks, so that if it gets on your skin, you can't remove it." And I continued to watch the news. A few minutes later, I happened to glance at Hal and saw tears streaming down his face. Struck by his pain and grief, I grew dismayed as I began to wonder what had happened to me. Had I become so brutalized that I could answer my son's question so matter-of-factly? As if he had asked me how a baseball is made or how a leaf functions. Had I become so accustomed to human brutality that I could be casual in its presence? In a sense, it is not surprising. The people of my generation have lived through an era of unspeakable horrors: the Holocaust in Europe, the dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Korean War, and the wars in Southeast Asia and the Middle East, to name a few. In the ensuing years, we have also borne witness to endless civil wars in Central America, the slaughter of more than 1 million civilians in the killing fields of Cambodia, ethnic cleansing in Bosnia, the bloodbaths in Rwanda, Sudan, and Algeria, the suicide attacks of September 11 on our own soil, and American retaliations in Afghanistan and Iraq. And on and on and on. As horrifying as these events are, mass killings are certainly not peculiar to our era. A friend once showed me a very thin book, only 10 or 15 pages long, that purported to be a capsule history of the world, a chronological list of the important events in recorded history. Can you guess how it read? Of course, one war after another, interrupted every now and then by a few non-violent events, such as the birth of Jesus and the invention of the printing press. What kind of species are we if the most important events in the brief history of humankind are situations in which people kill one another en masse? Moreover, we Americans display a chilling acceptance of violence that at times seems utterly absurd and mindless. When U.S. warplanes bombed Libya in retaliation for an upsurge in that country's acts of terrorism, a whopping 71% of our citizens approved of this military action, even though only 31% believed the raid would be effective in curbing future terrorism. What else can we conclude but that a substantial number of Americans find acts of pure vengeance an acceptable part of U.S. foreign policy? To be sure, the majority of citizens in most countries support the wars their governments launch. But Americans lead the developed nations of the earth in tolerating the astonishing fact that a mass shooting, defined as at least 4 victims, occurs daily in this country, and more than 100,000 people die from gun violence every year. I define aggression as an intentional action aimed at doing harm or causing physical or psychological pain. The action might be physical or verbal. Whether it succeeds in its goal or not, it is still aggression. Thus, If an angry friend throws a beer bottle at your head and you duck, so that the bottle misses its mark, it is still an aggressive act. The important thing is your friend's intention. But if a drunk driver unintentionally runs you down while you're attempting to cross the street, it is not an act of aggression, even though the harm you suffered is far greater than that caused by the beer bottle that missed. Aggression. Intentional action aimed at doing harm or causing physical or psychological pain. By this definition, we humans have proven ourselves to be a particularly aggressive species. No other animals so consistently and wantonly hit, torture, and kill